Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Near Memo with the lovely and talented Mike Blumenthal and me, as always, Greg Sterling. And today we have another special guest with us, Garrett Sussman, who's the Director of Marketing at iPullRank. And many of you know him from his prolific LinkedIn activity. And he just spoke at SEO Week in New York. And this is why he's on the show today, because he had a very, very provocative, interesting, and relevant presentation about personalization, personalized intelligence and AI mode, and we want to get into that. And we may decide to break this into two, depending on how it's going, because there's so much to talk about. And we're going to talk about what is it. We're going to talk about a really provocative year-long study that they ran with Profound that kind of got into the mechanics of personalization. How does this impact local? How does this impact SEO, and what does the sort of near-term future look like with personalization, AI mode, and other things? So welcome, Garrett. Glad to have you on.
Thanks for having me, guys. Obviously, I came from local. It's how I got into SEO, originally from Grados, working with Mike at GatherUp. And so it always holds a place in my heart. And we are in a weird space right now. So excited to dive in and get some very hot, spicy opinions.
Yeah, so for the folks that weren't at SEO Week and haven't seen your presentation, which we'll link to in the show notes, and I recommend people watch it, talk about what sort of at the highest level, what did you talk about? What was the presentation?
Yeah, so the focus, I think, in SEO, local SEO, and AI search right now is hyper personalization. Something we're all familiar with local, but in essence, I talked about how we need to, as marketers and SEOs, take into consideration how through AI search we are getting much more personalized results. It's very difficult to track. It changes our content strategy. It changes the way we approach business and AI search in general. And so I ran a bunch of experiments to show how that's happening and looking at what's coming and what's already here.
Personalization is one of the hallmarks of AI generally, ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, presumably. It remembers, it has a long kind of context window in memory. It remembers what you asked before. You can make references to things that you previously talked about. And so there's that kind of personalization, and it learns about your preferences. It learns about your biases, and then it answers things. I mean, I see this with ChatGPT all the time, but it doesn't know information other than what I've given it. It doesn't know anything about my history or my behavior or my interest other than what I've explicitly told it. Now, what Google, this specifically is about Google and Google personalized intelligence. So let's talk a little bit about what is that. Google announced that a few months ago, I think, or maybe last year. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this was in January, and we already know Google collects a lot of data about you, but you are basically now giving Google explicit permission to access different Google data sources in your ecosystem. So we're talking Gmail, calendar, photos, YouTube history. We already know it looks at your Google search, and allowing Google to basically, when relevant, take that information, that hyper personal private content, and use it to give you a better personalized result in AI mode and in Gemini and potentially ultimately in AI search results.
And yeah, the blog post
So
was
personal
January.
intelligence is on by default, but connected apps to the Google ecosystem is off by default. Is that correct?
So it is something that you need to opt into. And once you opt into it, then when you do a search in AI mode, it will actually reference a specific email from your Gmail or a specific
The
photo.
memory is defaulted on. The connected apps are defaulted off. It looks like to me when I'm looking at the personal intelligence settings screen.
It's defaulted on when you actually set it up. You
Mem-
have the ability to manage it, but the memory is defaulted on when
Right.
you opt in.
It's just to clarify, it's an opt-in, not an opt-out. They don't have it. They're not turning it on for everyone, and then people have to figure out how to opt out. It's something that you have to explicitly agree to do. In other words,
Yes.
share the contents of these apps, photos and Gmail, and what else is in there beyond that?
Calendar,
Calendar.
YouTube search history.
YouTube. Is there?
And obviously, it's obviously let's assume that Google were an ethical company and we could trust them. This would be a great benefit, right? It would be a convenience, and the machine would prompt you with information that would be helpful, and it would tailor responses to your interests and needs. And so it's a great idea in the abstract.
Absolutely. Significant improvement of the product. I mean, you just think about how much better your results are when you're logged into Google versus incognito. Just multiply that times like 1,000.
Right. So I mean, when I saw this, I absolutely did not. My response was, "No effing way I'm gonna do this." Part of me feels like I have to do this just to understand how it's working. Your presentation described, but as a consumer, as a person, it's like Google is already too intrusive and too manipulative, and I don't want to give it any more of my information because not only do I not trust Google, but then Google just becomes a conduit for all the bad actors out there where they can go in and say, hey, Google, give us all this data. I mean, it's already happening in the current government. Give us all this data about critics and dissidents and all of these. This is a China scenario, but let's not get too political here. I want to talk
But
about
as
the
Garrett
mechanics of
pointed
this.
out in his talk, even if you don't turn on the give apps permission,
Yes.
it one has memory defaults on, so it remembers all your queries. And then two, it has your search history. So even
Right.
without giving it access to your Gmail and your YouTube, whatever,
It's building up a history about you. It's
and
learning
brings
about
that
you.
into the AI memory. So it knows a lot about you,
It's
whatever you choose to do or not do.
okay. So Garrett, would you add anything to that about sort of implicit or personalization where somebody hasn't explicitly said, okay, personalize my results with these different apps and the content, but as Mike said, their search history and other inputs that Google is getting, that's almost as good, really, as a practical matter, I would imagine.
Philosophically, I think if you want to participate in digital society, Google has all your information. We can all agree that whether we consent or not, to your point about Google as a corporate entity, like has the data. How they decide to use it, the personal intelligence is a way for you to explicitly give them permission to do all sorts of creepy stuff with your data that in theory will improve the product and the experience. I feel like culturally and socially, we are not there yet, but I feel like that's the inevitable direction that we're going in. And so, I'm not an important person, so I don't give a crap if they have, access to my
But you
stuff. I think
are, you're on this podcast. So by virtue of that, we've
fair.
recognized you as as an important person. Well, I mean, there's a whole long conversation about privacy that we can have at another time, which is privacy and trust and all of these issues. This cluster of issues are very important. But there's so much material to get
Well,
to. I
the,
want to
the one
focus on
reason
that.
it's material here is because if apps are not opted into, for example, as a normal part of consumers' behavior, then some of what Garrett did is limited to the people that do that. Um, you can't extrapolate it to everybody. And so one of the questions that I would have is how many people actually participate given it's opt-in now? It's probably very few. But like everything with Google, sooner or later it becomes default.
There you go.
Nobody knows about this. People out in the world have no idea about any of this right now.
No, we're still at like less than 1% of the population. I think Mike's point is right on. I mean, Liz Reed gave a presentation or was on a podcast where she said we care about consent. I think AI mode. We've seen growth. I got some similar web data where we're seeing like 25% of Google users are actually starting to use it because they are starting to force feed us AI mode. The only reason all this is a big deal is AI overviews were the default version of SERPs. If AI overviews was an opt-in, then we wouldn't be talking about AI search and LLMs in the same way that we have in our search worlds. Going into whether AI mode and all of this will become a part of our daily process, I think it's inevitable. But to your point, right now, same way ChatGPT is just, 2% of the actual search market, that even ChatGPT doesn't really move the needle, nor does Bing. But eventually, like if Apple integrates personal intelligence with Siri, then all of a sudden that market expands significantly.
What our survey data show is that people, I mean, I've said this a million times, people really like the conversational experience. They prefer the conversational experience to traditional search. Traditional search is, in certain cases, is more efficient, but all things being equal, most people are going to say, I like either I want to use a combination of the two, or I prefer AI mode explicitly or, some equivalent conversational kind of interface.
What
And
was the
so
number
there
in the most recent one, Greg? Was it 20% of the people actually interfaced with AI mode? Most of them used it for contextual understanding and
well, we
were
yeah,
almost never made a choice in AI mode, but they were
we were
watching real
looking at it.
users do this.
We and the be and there's so we have both survey data and behavioral data, and we were looking. This was in the context of choosing a PI lawyer, but just let's just say directionally, people will embrace these tools because they like the experience better. And the question is, can they trust the underlying data? But that's a little bit of a tangent. But I think we can make the assumption that AI mode, because Google is, as you say, force feeding it at every turn. It's presenting it as a, try this, look at AI mode. And so I think we can assume that the numbers will continue to increase. But let's talk about unless you want to say something else on the end of that.
I was
Let's
just going
talk
to say,
about your
to your point, there's two mental models, right? The way that we use search and we've been trained to use search is different than a conversational search bot. Like we've been trained to use keywordese to, be efficient, use a couple of words to get the information we need because we all know how Google operates. But Google's been implementing natural language processing for decades now, like with Mom and Bert. And so once you get into this chat bot model, I think the way your brain processes it and uses it is different. Like, so that context is a big thing. We did an AI mode study last year as well with user data and behavioral interviews. And our local search was on like healthcare, finding a healthcare provider, and seeing people actually have the conversation around insurance and making that be a qualifier using natural language is a completely different experience than the way people use search. So anyway, but yeah,
right,
to move
right.
on.
So you get a lot more about their intent, and you get a lot more about what their priorities are and what's really important and what are the deal breakers and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's talk. In this SEO Week presentation, you talked about a 12-month study that you did with Profound that was really fascinating, that proved essentially the thesis about personalization, that all of the data that was kind of coming into the mix was changing search results depending upon the persona. And talk about that. What did you do and what did you find?
Yeah, there are two experiments. So the way I broke it down in this framework is when we're thinking about the personalization interaction with these LLMs is there's explicit context and implicit context. There's the implicit context that it's taking that you are not saying in your prompt, that it knows about you, data about location, about what we are talking about with personal intelligence. But then there's the explicit context where you're actually telling it about you. Like I just mentioned about finding a health provider, that I need an insurance that has, that is under, this provider when I'm looking for a doctor. So my study with Profound is I gave it explicit contents where I set up 4 different personas. I am, this gender, I make this much money, this is my job, this is what I'm into. And then I said, what is the best coffee machine for me? What is the best running shoes across 4 different products? And we ran that across 8 different AI search platforms for 12 months, over 100,000 prompts to see how the results were influenced. And what we found is when you give that explicit context, when it knows I make this much money, it makes different coffee machine recommendations statistically significant across that data. Now, this is a kind of lab environment. It's not in the wild. So, the way that we extrapolate any of these types of findings, I think we need to take everything with a grain of salt. And we've seen it change over time. Over that period, we saw ChatGPT move from 4 to 5. We saw Gemini go from 2 to 3. But for instance, if we told them that this person makes $150,000 per year, they were recommended, the much more expensive coffee machines versus someone who only makes 45,000 a year and they got like a Keurig recommendation. And so we saw this across all different brands, that this explicit context very much influenced the results. And one other really interesting aspect of the study was the language that they used in the LLM's output was different. So for instance, when it comes to salary, we found that it used premium language. It made assumptions that the person had disposable income.
About values. It's making assumptions about values.
Exactly. Whereas, like, if they didn't have as much money, they're like, you might need to consider whether you even get a coffee machine. Here's your budget. So there are brand implications, there's audience research implications. So that was the explicit experiment.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. And one of the things you mentioned, you referenced Kevin Indig's research. and been a bunch of research. Profound has done this research, and what it sort of collectively shows, and this goes to the debate about how influential LLMs are, but what it collectively shows is that people are using, especially in a product context, using LLMs to get a short list of recommended products. So I'm looking for a coffee maker. I want to see the three best in this price range, based on reviews and longevity and whatever the considerations are. And then it will show you those recommendations. And the studies show that very often people will take that information and that becomes the competitive set that they choose from. And then they may go off and do subsequent research or get reviews, or look at reviews or whatever. But this is setting up their sort of universe of choices. Now they can break out of it if none of them are satisfying, but it's not like going to Google and seeing 10 options or 20 options or that product grid where you've got 16 different things going on. It's like, here are the three or here are the four, and that conditions people's subsequent choices. If that's true, if that holds in the real world, and that is my anecdotal experience is pretty consistent with that in my own usage, then there are pretty profound implications for these LLMs recommending, here are the running shoes, here are the places to stay, et cetera, et cetera. You're really steering people toward, it's not just here's a result, click it or don't click it. It's like we're steering you toward these outcomes, and it's pretty significant.
I mean, there's a choice paradox. We lived like in the 70s when you went to the grocery store, there's what, like 100 products in the grocery store? Now you walk into a grocery store and there's like thousands and thousands and thousands. I think we are overwhelmed with choice. And I think over time, people want to be given just a few options that is actually relevant and personalized for them. All these studies are tricky because search behavior is changing very rapidly. There was another study talking about kind of like a magical realism when it comes to AI. People who are not familiar with AI, they think it's magic. They're skeptical, but they're also willing to trust it. I think as that trust is built over time and they have positive experiences with their AI interactions, that's going to be the way that people search. So to your point, there are implications for businesses with this technology.
You referenced the trust or lack of trust in AI, and there's a lot of data on that. We have some data on that. I think it's a very nuanced conversation because it depends on context, depends on what you're doing, what you're looking up. And what people used to say in the beginning is, yeah, I totally trust it. 2/3 would say, yeah, I trust it. Now what people say is, I trust it, it depends, or I trust it somewhat. And so people have gotten more sophisticated. The users have gotten more sophisticated. They're still using it. They use it independent of the question of trust. So it's not one to one. It's not like I trust it, I don't trust it, I use it, I don't use it. It's like I'm using it, but I may, in this particular situation, not trust it, or I validate with something else. I go to, like in a local context, I do the research and then I go to Google to verify that this is accurate information. So there's a lot of nuance in that discussion. But yes, people will become, I don't buy the 1% of traffic referrals is ChatGPT. And so this is really just a marginal use case and we can all just kind of go back to regular SEO. I do not believe that that's an accurate reflection of what's going on in the market because of all the zero click behavior. But anyway,
That's fair.
go. Um, so talk about gender. You talked about income, and there were some differences in terms of what Gemini was doing in terms of, you talk about job title in the presentation. So there's gender, job title, and then salary. So Gemini was inferring salary, others were not. So talk about that stuff because that's
Yeah, there's
interesting as
model to
well.
model differences. And the other interesting, as you called out, was, so for instance, when we started to do some citation research, and there's so much research. If I can encourage one thing to any SEOs listening to this is like, run experiments, do your own research, because there's no blanket statements anymore. Everything, to your point about the nuance, Greg, is like industries, businesses, locations, it's all super specific. We wouldn't have the same approach to a city that we would to, a rural location and the way that people search there and who searches there. But for gender, what was interesting was we did some citation research on the shoes. And what we found was when the citations were examined for the gender, we actually found references to women's driven running shoe websites. They did not appear in the citations for the male personas. So when you're starting to think from like a digital PR standpoint and where you want to appear, you need to make sure that you are showing up for your ideal persona, because there's going to be the selection bias based on that context as well that makes it more complex and messy.
Right, and there's a kind of underlying discussion about are the LLMs biased? What are the assumptions LLMs are making about people's choices and tastes, and who should be shopping with what? From there's just a bunch of
45-year-old white programmers in
well,
Great book reference. If you've never read it, in 2020, Brian Christian wrote The Alignment Problem, and he talks about this specifically. In the SEO space, we've all got obsessed with the idea of like vector embeddings, right? But like the training data, to Mike's point, is, Western Hemisphere based on a ton of English
Yep.
writing historically, based on, I think it was like in the 90s, we started to move from using like male pronouns for everything. And all that is baked into the common crawl data sets. Yes, there are situations that depend on RAG where it actually retrieves up-to-date, fresh information from the internet. But the whole sort of training data is the history of the internet, which is problematic.
Yep. So let's talk about the seeding piece of this, because, and we'll get to the tactical responses, which you've alluded to, sort of personas and citation research. One piece of this that was really interesting is you were testing how different pieces of content, emails and images, would affect the recommendations, because Google, as we discussed at the beginning, is starting to draw upon Gmail and photos and YouTube videos. So tell us about that aspect of the study.
So this was a personal intelligence experiment that we ran over 3 weeks. And in essence, me and two of my colleagues at iPollRank, Michael Tando and Kate Dombrowski, basically set up 3 different accounts. We had a completely clean Gmail Google account that wasn't used, tabula rasa, completely not connected to anything. Then we had a second completely clean Gmail account that we connected to personal intelligence. We opted in. And then the third one was my ridiculously noisy personal Gmail account with decades of emails and photos and everything connected. And I connected that to personal intelligence. Don't judge me. And so what we then did is we set up an experiment where over 2 weeks, every single day, we ran about 50 prompts. They were 8 different products across everything from banks from a local perspective to shoes and productivity software tools. And then we had a set of 6 prompts that are, what are the best versions of this? What are the best versions for this specific attribute? What are 3 recommendations based on what you know about me? And so they all had the same structure. And so what we did is
And
we
this is
ran
this
those.
is all AI mode, right? You're in AI mode with this.
Yes, it was all in AI mode
Okay.
connected to Google Personal Intelligence, except for the control study that wasn't. And we ran it for 3 weeks. And then halfway through, what I did is I sent an email from a different account to each of these accounts for each of the different products saying, hey, I recommend this brand. I like it because of X, Y, and Z. And then I went to a local store and I took photos of all the products and I uploaded all of those to Google Photos to see how it would be influence the results. And it was statistically significant for this specific data set. So I'm not going to make any sort of generalization prognostications, but I will say that for our data set, we saw a significant lift in recommendations across the board for all of these products, mostly from email. Photos did not have the same impact, but we saw the products that I seeded in the emails were not showing up in the original subset of products. They were like the bottom 10, they really wouldn't show up. And they consistently had about 60% to 80% visibility in the recommended results for the accounts connected to personal intelligence and actually referenced those emails consistently.
So after the emails were sent, those results started showing up in the accounts connected to personal intelligence, or opted into personal intelligence.
Precisely. A lot of the times you would get the context in AI mode saying, like, based on this email that you received from Garrett Sussman, we think you would like, this Solomon running shoe brand because it's great for durability. It would actually parrot the copy from the emails. So it was very much influencing the recommendations pretty clearly from the experiment.
So why do you think that email was weighted so much more heavily as a signal than
That's a good question. I think that, Mike's done a lot of research on image, visual recognitions and Google's tools. And while it's really excellent, it isn't as specific. There's a lot of noise in photos, I think. And so
Well, there's more ambiguity around a photo, right? Why is the
that too.
photo there?
And there's more processing costs. I mean, the
Mhm.
reality is that getting to an understanding of a photo takes a whole extra step. You've already got the text in the email. That's easy to bring in
It's
through a
explicit,
recommendation. It's
right?
explicit.
I mean,
And there's nothing explicit in a photo. Plus, you got to process it to even get
well,
what's implicit in the photo. So,
the,
and I would assume the costs are a big driver here.
yeah, that's probably a good insight. If you take a picture of a inside a store, Google may have no idea what the intent behind that photo is, you know. But you even used you even used some fake brands, and you said those were recommended.
Yes. So as a additional part of the study, once we saw statistical significance, we on the last couple of days added in the same email format and the same photo format for completely fake made up brands. And those were recommended consistently as well, which I guess is not really surprising if it's over indexing right now. There is in the show notes, highly recommend. There's a PDF that Google wrote on personal intelligence acknowledging a lot of these potential limitations of AI mode. But yeah, they showed up. I mean, in my SEO week talk, I kind of joked about email scam marketing is back. I would hope that Google would get better at identifying the issues there, but it's still an LLM. It still lacks a lot of control, even though it's in the product.
And you said I mean, this was fascinating. Even unopened email was influential.
Yeah, there were some anecdotes independent that I had to identify as I was running the experiment because here I am, like literally for 2 hours every morning looking at these results. And so there was two really surprising cases that I called out. One is a newsletter that I received over a year ago for in the SEO space for the productivity tools that was cited in the AI mode that referenced three different products. And I went back to find because it showed me the subject line of that email. I went to find the email. It was an unopened email. So then I opened it. I found it right in the middle of the body where this guy who I like his newsletter, Marco Giordana, like talked about this product.
You don't
And
really
so
like it if
it's
you're not
nuts.
opening the email.
There's a lot of
Well,
noise out there, Greg.
the reality is if Google has aspirations to be your agentic partner, they need the information from all the emails you didn't have time to read because they're going to solve this. Whatever information problem is in that email, they're going to solve it for you.
Well, and Meredith Whitaker, who's the CEO of Signal, has talked about for agentic. I mean, this is a sort of a tangent. For agentic to work, people have to give it access to all kinds of things: calendar, bank accounts, you know, credit card information, so on and so forth. And it needs kind of holistic access and information to be able to sort of carry things out. And this is sort of a baby steps version of that, right? I mean, it's sort of the foot in the door to get us accustomed to giving Google. I mean, Google already has my credit card information on file with Google Pay, and I just, you know, click a button and there it is, and it populates the form and accelerates the checkout.
To
Talk a
that
little
point,
bit.
one interesting thing that came up in the study before we even see the emails is Google has all of our receipts and our confirmation
Yes, I was
emails.
going to ask you about that. Talk about that.
And they, oh my goodness, Google loved telling me that I bought stuff. Like it was uncomfortable because you're getting this output about like hoodie recommendations. I love my hoodies. And it would say, well, clearly you love Reigning Champ and Aviator Nation. Here's the 3 times that you've bought it in the last like year. And as a human, I did not like that, but it was interesting that it over-indexed on these transactional emails. One next step of the study that I have not done yet is I am going to go through all of the we have scraped all of the links to the emails that we got, and I want to see what percentage are transactional emails, what percentage are marketing emails, what percentage are those personal emails, because I'd be very curious. I did not see a ton of marketing emails in my study. However, that's not to say it didn't happen. I did get, subscriber updates or click up emails about product marketing updates. So they did come. It just wasn't as explicit as the
We
personal.
have to assume that Google is going to refine this and that the balance of the weighting of the signals will evolve over time. And this is right now, they're just very much in an experimental phase or in the early days of this. So also talk about your family's names showed up in some of these recommendations, and that was weird and somewhat
Yeah,
uncomfortable.
uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. And I remember because it was last Hanukkah, I was looking for gifts for my daughter. And, I might have mentioned her name once, Sammy. I put it out there, but I might have mentioned her name once. And so then when I was looking for streaming network recommendations, it
Vi-
gave a very personal, yeah, in the study, basically saying, hey, you're knowing that you're in a family, your daughter Sammy loves Bluey, you were looking for gifts. So we would recommend Disney Plus because your wife and you can watch, HBO Max as well and blah blah blah. What was interesting and what is very tricky with all of this too is we know that we have explicit citations from the Gmail and the photos. We do not have explicit citations from our search history. And one thing I called out in the study, which was really interesting to me, is when I had a general prompt, a general query, which was recommend a streaming service for me, it would go into, that personal recommendation. And then in the citations, you could see a CNET article that said the top 10 family streaming services. And I did not give any context of that in my search. So there is a lot of implicit data that's being pulled in the results.
And I would argue that Google is probably going to have to focus on that, because once things like your family members' names start showing up and these kinds of very personal details, it's going to freak people out. If you look at all the privacy surveys, we are in a very different position today than we were a decade ago, when these tech companies were seen as cool and making the world a better place and really innovative. Today we've got the oligarchy, and there's this really adversarial relationship, I think, between technology and users. Users are engaged with technology because they have to be. This is the society we're in. Everybody's using social media, everybody's using search. But I think people are very ambivalent. And I don't think Google can take anybody's consent or participation for granted. So what's going to probably wind up happening is a lot of these implicit signals will be brought to bear on this. And they're going to have to find the right balance between something that seems too intrusive and something that is genuinely useful and helpful.
I think there's a lot of, to your point, nuance about audience types. It's going to be very interesting to see different demographics and how they kind of encounter this, and how they interact with it. For the past couple of years, we've seen people preferring to go to, like, younger people going to TikTok or more people going to Reddit for their searches. I think as long as Google is the default version on search of many devices and ecosystems, people, whether they have a problem with this data or not, will continue to engage. I don't want to say we give too much credit. I think people, myself included, we have our laziness genes in us.
Of
Like
course.
we don't want to expend too much cognitive energy switching from the defaults. Whether that's a new channel, a new way of searching.
Right, and there's
So
data that backs that up. Was a really interesting study that paid people to use Bing versus Google and tried to measure whether that would continue after the end of the experiment. And for a small percentage of people it did, but most people went back to what they were comfortable and familiar with. So I want to break at this point, because I think this is a lot of content for one episode, and we will bring you back for part 2 of this, where we're going to talk about what the implications for local are, SEO in general, and measurement, and how do marketers respond to all of this. There's a lot of important things kind of shifting your perspective and shifting your tactics. And then we'll do a little bit of sort of prognostication about the near-term future. So thank you very much, Garrett Sussman, and we'll have you on immediately after we conclude this for part 2, which will show up a week from now. Okay, thanks.